December 30, 1943, off the coast of Brittany near a small island called Ile de Groix, a few miles south of the German-held port of Lorient. The Hawker Typhoon fighters of 266 Squadron, a Rhodesian squadron of the Royal Air Force, come down onto a target moving slowly over a grey and unquiet sea. It is a strange target and an almost helpless one, and it will not survive the next few minutes. It is an aeroplane, and at first glance an ordinary one, a 3-engine transport with a corrugated metal skin, the patient workhorse of the German Air Force, slow and ungainly and almost gentle in the air. What is not ordinary is the thing the aeroplane is wearing. Slung beneath it, braced to the wings and to the belly, is an enormous metal hoop. A ring. A circle of light alloy wider than the aircraft is long, holding the machine inside it like a coin dropped through a wedding band. It is one of the oddest-looking flying machines of the entire war, and to a British eye it should have looked strangely familiar, because Britain had sent aircraft wearing almost exactly that ring into the air nearly 4 years earlier, in the first cold winter of the war, over the grey estuaries of home. Hold on that image for a moment, because everything that follows lives inside it. A German aeroplane, over German-held water, wearing what looks unmistakably like a British idea. The questions it raises are the questions this whole story is built around. Where did that ring come from? Who thought of it first? And if the answer is Britain, then why, 3.5 years later, was a German crew flying inside what looked so much like a copy of it? This is not really a story about an aeroplane. It is a story about how two enemies, cut off from each other by a narrow sea and by everything else that a war puts between two nations, arrived at the same strange machine. It is a story about an invisible weapon that nearly strangled Britain in the dark months of 1939, about the men who took that weapon apart with their bare hands on a freezing mudflat, and about the flying ring that Britain built to beat it. And it is a story about a claim, the claim in the title of this video that Germany copied that ring. Because the truth of that claim is more interesting and more honest than a simple yes. To understand any of it, you have to go back to the autumn of 1939, and you have to understand a fear that had nothing to do with tanks or bombers or invasion. It was a fear about the sea floor. Britain in 1939 was not a country that could feed itself. It imported food, oil, iron ore, timber, and almost everything else that a modern nation burns through in a week, and it imported all of it by ship. Roughly 2/3 of the food on a British table crossed water to get there. The whole island floated on a river of merchant vessels moving in and out of the Thames estuary, the Bristol Channel, the Mersey, the Clyde, and the East Coast ports that fed London its coal. Cut those arteries, and the country does not fall in a battle, it withers. Everyone in the Admiralty understood this. It was the oldest strategic truth Britain had. And in the first weeks of the war, the Germans found a way to attack those arteries that the Royal Navy, the most experienced navy on earth, did not at first know how to stop. There is a phrase people use for that first winter of the war, the phony war, because on land in the west almost nothing seemed to be happening. The great armies sat behind their fortifications and stared at one another across a quiet frontier, and to a civilian reading the papers it could feel as though the war had not really started. That impression was a lie, and the place where it was most obviously a lie was the sea. There was nothing phony about the war in the water. From the very first days ships were being sunk, sailors were drowning in the cold, and a silent battle was being fought in the shipping lanes, with a ferocity that never let up. While the soldiers waited, the merchant seamen and the men of the Royal Navy were already dying, and the deadliest single thing they faced in those months was not the submarine or the bomber, but the mine lying quietly on the bottom. The weapon was a mine, but it was not the kind of mine sailors had feared for a generation. The mines of the First World War, and most of the mines still in service in 1939, were contact mines. They floated at a set depth, held by a cable anchored to the seabed, waiting for a ship's hull to physically strike one of the horns that studded them. They were deadly, but they were understandable. You could sweep them. You towed a serrated cable between two ships, snagged the mooring wire, cut it, and the mine bobbed to the surface where a gunner could sink it with a rifle fire. The Royal Navy had been doing exactly this since the last war. It had a whole doctrine, a whole fleet of little requisition trawlers and their tough civilian crews, built around the idea that a mine was a thing on a wire that you could cut. The new German weapon had no wire. It did not float. It lay flat on the seabed in shallow coastal water, in the estuaries and the harbour approaches where the merchant traffic was thickest, and it waited. It did not need to be touched. It was a magnetic mine, an influence mine, and it worked on a principle that felt almost like witchcraft to the men who first met it. Every large steel ship, simply by being built of steel and by moving through the Earth's magnetic field for months and years, becomes a weak magnet. It carries its own magnetic signature, a faint distortion in the field around it, invisible, silent, always there. The German mine carried a delicate needle, a magnetic detonator tuned to notice that distortion. When a ship passed overhead, its magnetic field nudged the needle closed a circuit, and several hundred kilograms of explosive detonated on the seabed directly beneath the vessel's hull. Think about what that means. The mine does not strike the side of the ship where the plating is strongest and where a hole can sometimes be contained. It explodes underneath in the water, and the water does not compress. The full force of the blast is driven upward into the keel, the ship's spine. A magnetic mine did not hole a ship, it broke its back. And because the mine lay on the bottom and touched nothing, the old sweeps were useless. There was no cable to cut. You could drag your serrated wire back and forth across a minefield all day and catch nothing, and then watch a freighter behind you lift bodily out of the water and split in two. The mines began to take a terrible toll in the last months of 1939. On November 13, 1939, in the Thames estuary near the Tongue-Light vessel, the mine-laying cruiser His Majesty's ship Adventure struck one. More than 20 of her crew were killed, and many more wounded. The destroyer, His Majesty's ship Blanche, standing close by, detonated another and went down, the first Royal Navy destroyer lost in the war. A few days earlier, a field of these mines had been laid across the North Sea shipping lanes by German destroyers, and on November 18th the Dutch liner Simon Bolivar ran into it and sank with heavy loss of life. The reported death toll varies between sources even now, with newspapers at the time citing as many as 140 lives, and later careful accounts settling nearer 86. But by any count it was a slaughter of civilians in peaceful-looking water. On the night of November 21, the brand-new light cruiser His Majesty's ship Belfast, one of the finest ships in the fleet, had her keel broken by a magnetic mine as she left the Firth of Forth. She did not sink, but she was crippled. She would spend nearly 3 years in dockyard hands being rebuilt. That single mine, costing the Germans almost nothing, took one of Britain's best warships out of the war until the end of 1942. The Germans were laying these mines by every means they had. Submarines slipped them into the harbour approaches on the seabed as they passed. Fast destroyers ran across the North Sea in the dark and sowed whole fields of them in a single night, and bombers scattered them by parachute into the estuaries and river mouths, which is how one would eventually end up on the mud where the British could reach it. The air-dropped version even had its own German designation, a name that marked it simply as an air mine of the first type, and it was these parachute-laid weapons that closed channel after channel through the worst weeks. At Harwich, one of the busiest of the East Coast ports, the destroyer His Majesty's ship Gypsy was mined and lost in the harbour approaches, sinking within sight of the shore. Every one of these losses forced another stretch of water to be declared unsafe, and every closure sent a fresh shiver through the shipping timetables on which the country ran. The numbers stacked up with frightening speed. In November 1939 alone, something close to 200,000 tons of shipping went to the bottom from mines, and the Port of London, the beating heart of British trade, was very nearly closed. Sea lanes had to be shut every time a mine was suspected, which meant ships waiting outside, riding at anchor, burning fuel, exposed. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, the political head of the Royal Navy, later described it plainly. Hitler, he said, had a secret weapon, and for a few weeks in that first winter it was working. The German leadership crowed about it. They believed, with some reason, that they had found the loose thread that would unravel the whole British war effort before it had properly begun. Their engineers had built a weapon their enemy could not sweep, could not see, and could not answer. Inside the logic of what they knew, they were right. And this is the part worth slowing down for because it is the hinge of the entire story. The German magnetic mine was not a lucky accident or a crude improvisation. It was the product of a serious, capable, methodical weapons science. A science that had thought hard about how ships work and how a mine might exploit them. The men who designed it were not fools. They had built something genuinely new. Their mistake, and it was the same mistake made by clever people in every war, was to assume that because they could not imagine the counter did not exist. They had built a lock they believed had no key. What they had not counted on was that the key would be forged not by a rival weapons bureau, but by a handful of naval officers on a mud bank in the dark, and by a scientist with a reputation for ignoring the proper way of doing things, and by an aircraft company that would build the answer over Christmas because the First Lord of the Admiralty told them to. The break, when it came out of pure luck and pure nerve, and it happened in the mud at a place called Shoeburyness. On the night of November 22nd into November 23rd, 1939, watchers on the shore at Shoeburyness, at the mouth of the Thames, saw a German aircraft come in low over the estuary and release objects by parachute. This was itself a small gift, because it meant the Germans were now laying these mines from the air, scattering them into the shipping channels, and it meant that occasionally, by chance, one might come down not in deep water, but on the tidal flats, on ground that the sea would uncover at low tide. That is exactly what happened. When the tide went out, there on the exposed mud lay an intact German magnetic mine, the secret weapon itself, whole, undetonated, waiting. The Navy understood at once what it had been handed. If they could recover that mine intact, if they could take it apart without setting it off and understand exactly how its magnetic trigger worked, then the invisible weapon would stop being invisible. The order came down from the highest level. Recover it at all costs. The man sent to do it was a mine and torpedo specialist from the Navy's shore establishment at Portsmouth, His Majesty's ship Vernon, a lieutenant commander named John Overy. With him went a second officer, Lieutenant Commander Roger Lewis, and a small party of ratings. What those men did in the early hours of November 23 is one of the coldest tests of nerve in the whole war, and it was done almost in silence, with no one watching but each other. They knew the mine was designed to kill ships, but they had no idea what other traps might be built into it, what booby fittings might fire if the wrong screw was turned. They knew it was magnetically triggered, which meant that every steel tool in their kit, every buckle, every tin button, every nail in their boots was a potential trigger. So they worked out what metal they were carrying and they got rid of it. They had special tools made from brass and other non-magnetic metals, because brass will not disturb a magnetic needle. Lewis took a careful impression of a securing ring on the mine so that a proper non-magnetic spanner could be manufactured overnight to fit it exactly. And then, at low water, in the dark and the wet, Overy and a chief petty officer named Baldwin approached the first mine while the others waited at a distance. That distance was not caution for its own sake. It was so that if Overy made a mistake, if the mine fired, there would still be men alive who had watched what he did up to that point and could tell the next party what not to do. They removed the first fitting. Nothing happened. They turned the mine, carefully, and found a second detonator of a kind they recognized, similar to the trigger on a German contact mine, and they drew that too. And then it was done. The fangs, as Overy put it afterward, had been drawn. They had the mine whole and safe, its magnetic heart open to inspection. It was carried back to His Majesty's ship Vernon, where the scientists of the mine design department, among them a physicist named Dr. Albert Wood, could take the trigger mechanism apart and read it like a book. They learned the polarity it responded to. They learned how sensitive it was. They learned the exact magnetic conditions that made it fire. And the moment they knew that, the weapon that had nearly closed the Thames became a problem with the solution. The country understood in its quiet way how much those men had done. Overy was decorated with the Distinguished Service Order by King George VI on the parade ground at His Majesty's ship Vernon in December 1939, and Lewis received the same, with medals for the ratings who had helped. They were among the very first naval decorations of the war. There is a hard footnote to that morning, one that the newsreels never carried. The chief petty officer who had knelt beside Overy at the mine, Baldwin, was killed only weeks later, in February 1940, in the course of the same deadly trade of taking German weapons apart. The work did not become safe just because the first mine had given up its secret. And there is a quiet piece of justice in where that first recovered mine ended up. It survives to this day, preserved and on display, aboard the cruiser His Majesty's ship Belfast. The very ship that a magnetic mine had crippled in that same terrible November. The weapon and one of its most famous victims now sit under the same roof, the hunter and the hunted, kept together so that people can stand and look at the thing that so nearly won the war at sea in a single winter, If you are watching this and a member of your family served in the Royal Navy's mine disposal branch, or in the little ships of the minesweeping trade, this is a good moment to put their name in the comments, because these are exactly the men whose work never made the newsreels and whose courage was of a kind that leaves no smoke and no photograph. Now the scientist had the secret. The question became what to do with it. And here the story splits into two answers, because the British did not rely on a single clever trick. They attacked the problem from several directions at once, and it is the range of that response, more than any one gadget, that tells you what kind of war machine Britain was becoming. The first answer was to make the ships themselves invisible to the mines. If a magnetic mine fires because it senses a ship's magnetic field, then remove the field and the ship can sail straight over the mine and nothing will happen. The scientist who drove this work was a Canadian-born chemist serving in the Naval Reserve. Commander Charles Goodeve, a restless, inventive, slightly impatient man who had a gift for finding the simple answer that the textbooks had overlooked. He and his colleagues developed a process for cancelling out a ship's magnetism. It was given the name degaussing after the gauss, the scientific unit of magnetic strength, and there was a grim little joke buried in the word, because it sounded like delousing, the cleaning of a ship of vermin. Now they were cleaning ships of magnetism. Degaussing could be done two ways. The thorough way was to fix a girdle of electrical cable around the hull of a ship and pass a current through it, generating a field that exactly opposed and cancelled the ship's own. That worked permanently, but it took time and copper, both of which were scarce. The faster, cruder way was called wiping. You dragged a heavy cable carrying a powerful electrical pulse up and down the outside of the hull, and the surge of current would, in effect, reset the ship's magnetic signature and flatten it out for months at a time. A ship could be wiped in an afternoon. In the frantic first half of 1940, before the evacuation from Dunkirk, hundreds upon hundreds of vessels were wiped or fitted with degaussing coils, until much of the merchant fleet and the little ships that would soon cross to France were, magnetically speaking, nearly silent. It was one of the great unsung industrial efforts of the early war, thousands of ships treated in a matter of months. The second answer was to sweep the mines actively, to make them explode harmlessly before a real ship arrived. Goodeve was central to this too. If a mine fires when it senses a ship's field, then you tow something across the seabed that fakes a ship's field, a decoy magnetic signature strong enough to trip the trigger from a safe distance. The method that emerged used two long electrical cables trailed behind a wooden-hulled trawler. Wood, because a wooden ship has almost no magnetic signature of its own and will not set off the very mines it is hunting. A heavy pulse of current sent down those cables threw out a magnetic field across the water, and mines lying on the bottom ahead would sense it and detonate at a distance, throwing up their great columns of water where no ship was. It was tested with model boats on a boating lake near Portsmouth before it ever went to sea. It worked. Through the spring and summer of 1940, it cleared mines by the dozen and then by the hundred, and it became standard practice for the rest of the war. There was an even bolder version of the same idea, and it deserves a mention because of the sheer nerve of it. The Navy took a number of old merchant ships and built into their bows an enormous electromagnet, a great coil that threw a powerful magnetic field out ahead of the vessel. Then they sailed these ships deliberately, straight into suspected minefields, so that the mines would sense the field reaching ahead of the bow and detonate at a distance in front of the ship rather than beneath it. They were called mine destructor ships, and serving aboard one meant sailing on purpose into the exact water everyone else was ordered to avoid, trusting that the field would fire the mine far enough ahead to leave the hull intact. It did not always work, and it was punishing, dangerous duty, but it was one more proof of how many directions the British were willing to attack this single problem from at once. So the British already had two broad answers, invisibility and sweeping from the sea. But there was a third answer, and it is the one this whole story has been circling toward, because it is the one that flew, and it is the one that wore the ring. The idea was simple to state and very hard to build. If a magnetic mine can be set off from a distance by a fake magnetic field, and if that field can be thrown out by an electrical coil, then why does the coil have to be dragged behind a slow boat at all? Why not carry it through the air? Fly a coil low over the water, over the very channels where the mines lie, energize it, and let its field reach down through the shallow water to the seabed, and detonate the mines from above. An aircraft could cover in minutes a stretch of channel that would take a trawler hours. An aircraft could reach a newly reported minefield almost at once, before a single ship had to risk it. It was the fastest possible answer to a fresh drop of mines. All you needed was an aircraft big enough to carry an enormous electrical hoop, and crews willing to fly that hoop at the sea. The aircraft they chose was the Vickers Wellington, a twin-engine medium bomber, and it was chosen for a specific reason that is central to this story and that most people get wrong. The Wellington had an unusual structure. Its airframe was built on a geodetic principle, a lattice of light metal strips crisscrossing like the weave of a basket, a design that made the aircraft extraordinarily strong and able to absorb damage that would tear an ordinary aircraft apart. That geodetic airframe was the work of a Vickers engineer whose name you may know, Barnes Wallis, later famous for the bouncing bombs of the dam raids and for enormous earthquake bombs. And here is the thing that is worth saying plainly, because it is repeated wrongly again and again. Barnes Wallis did not invent the flying ring. He did not design the mine-clearing aircraft. His contribution was the tough, forgiving airframe that made a good platform for the job. The ring itself, the magnetic installation, was a separate effort, drawing on the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, on the Admiralty scientists who understood the mine, and on the Vickers engineering team at the works at Weybridge. If you take one myth away from this video, let it be that one. The ring was not a Barnes Wallis invention. It was a collaboration, and its driving engineer at Vickers was a young man named George Edwards, who would go on after the war to lead the whole British aircraft industry. The aircraft was given a deliberately misleading name. It was called the DWI Wellington, and those letters stood for Directional Wireless Installation. That is a cover story. It has nothing to do with wireless or radio direction finding. The name was invented precisely to make anyone who overheard it think the Great Ring was some kind of radio aerial, rather than the anti-mine weapon it actually was. Even the label was a small act of deception, which tells you how seriously the secret was guarded. The ring itself was the heart of it. A vast circular coil, about 48 feet across on the first aircraft, with some builds using rings of around 51 feet, housed inside a light fairing and braced beneath the fuselage and out along the wings. Inside the fairing ran the coil, made of aluminium rather than copper, because copper was precious and aluminium would do the job at less weight. To push enough current through that coil to throw a mine detonating field down into the sea, the aircraft needed its own power station on board, because the engines alone could not spare it. So into the fuselage went a separate motor, on the first version a Ford V8, an ordinary motor car engine, driving an electrical generator of around 35 kilowatts. Guns, bomb racks, and the bomb sight were all stripped out. The aircraft was not going to fight anything, and it was not going to carry bombs. It was going to fly a magnetic field over the water. Because the Great Ring and the current in it would ruin an ordinary magnetic compass, the crews had to navigate with a gyroscopic compass instead, one that did not depend on the Earth's magnetism. The work was done at desperate speed over the winter of 1939 into 1940, and it was done under the direct, impatient eye of Churchill himself. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he wanted this weapon in the air, and George Edwards at Weybridge was required to report progress personally, night after night, with photographs to prove how far the conversion had come by the end of each day. The mechanism recovered from the mine at Shoeburyness gave the engineers the exact figures they needed. They knew precisely how strong a field the ring had to produce, and at what height, because they knew exactly what would make a German mine fire. The trials were flown over Salisbury Plain in the depth of one of the coldest winters anyone could remember, a winter so bitter that the ground froze hard and temperatures fell well below freezing for days on end. It was brutal weather in which to be testing a hastily built and only half understood machine, wrestling a heavy aircraft close to the ground while a car engine roared away in the fuselage feeding current into a giant experimental coil. Nothing about it was comfortable and nothing about it was certain. It was, in the truest sense, an experiment being flown by the people who might die if the sums were wrong. 3 weeks or so after the work began, they had numbers that made the crews swallow hard. To detonate the mines, the ring had to pass over them low, very low. The safe working height was between 35 feet and 60 feet above the water. 35 feet is the absolute minimum, and it is not a comfortable minimum, because 35 feet is roughly the height of a 3-story house, flown at the sea at well over 100 miles an hour in a heavy aircraft, often in poor weather, in order deliberately to make a large explosive charge go off in the water just behind you. That is the money number in this story, 35 feet. Remember it, because it is the number that very nearly killed a British crew within days. The first success came on the night of January 8 into January 9, 1940. A DWI Wellington, flying its low pass over the estuary waters, threw its field down into the sea, and a German magnetic mine that had lain there silent and patient rose up in a great tower of water and spray. The invisible weapon had been beaten from the air for the first time. From that moment, the flying ring was a proven thing, no longer a theory sketched by scientists, but a machine that had reached down and killed a mine with nothing but a magnetic field and nerve. A few days later, on January 13, 1940, the crews learned exactly how thin the margin was. A DWI Wellington on a sweep drifted a little too low, below that 35-foot floor at the wrong instant. The mine beneath it fired a fraction of a second early, while the aircraft was almost directly above it rather than safely past. The blast came up out of the sea and hit the aircraft from below with tremendous force, throwing the heavy Wellington upward some 40 feet as though a giant hand had swatted it. The crew recorded a shock of around 10 times the force of gravity, enough to knock the breath out of a man and enough to destroy a lesser airframe. Hatches were torn away, and yet the geodetic structure, that woven basket of metal, held. The aircraft flew home. This is the one place where Barnes-Wallis truly enters the mine-clearing story, not as the designer of the ring, but as the designer of the frame that survived its own weapon going off underneath it. A conventional aircraft might have come apart in the air. The Wellington did not. The men who flew these aircraft belonged to a specially formed unit, given the deliberately dull cover name of No. 1 General Reconnaissance Unit, so that its true purpose would not be obvious from its title. They flew from the Kent coast, from around the airfield at Manston, out over the Thames estuary, sweeping the channels that fed London, clearing the water ahead of the merchant convoys and the coastal traffic. They were unarmed. They had given up their guns for the ring, in the crowded, contested airspace over southeast England that would soon become the battleground of the Battle of Britain. An unarmed aircraft trundling along at low level over the water was a horribly soft target, and the mine clearers depended on fighter cover and on luck to stay alive. In home waters, remarkably, no DWI Wellington was ever recorded as being shot down by the enemy, a mercy that the German crews doing the identical job later in the war would not be granted. The ring aircraft did not stay in Britain. As the ship degaussing program and the naval sweeps matured, and as the whole layered defence began to master the mine in home waters, the flying rings were needed elsewhere. In the late spring of 1940, a detachment of DWI Wellingtons was sent out to Egypt, to the Middle East, to keep open the single most strategically vital waterway in the British Empire, the Suez Canal. The Axis air forces mined the canal repeatedly, and a canal is the perfect place for a mine, because it is narrow, it cannot be bypassed, and closing it for even a few days chokes the flow of men and supplies between Britain and its armies in the desert and beyond. The flying rings swept the canal, swept the harbour approaches, swept the sea lanes around the eastern Mediterranean and the approaches to Malta. There is a deep irony buried in that later service. By the time the tide of the war had turned, the same British ring aircraft were sometimes clearing mines to reopen ports that had just been captured from the Axis, unpicking from the air the minefields their enemies had sown. An improved version of the aircraft appeared as the work went on. The original Ford engine and its generator were heavy, and the cooling was marginal, and the gyroscopic compass was never wholly reliable. The second version replaced the car engine with a proper aircraft engine, a de Havilland Gypsy 6 driving a more powerful generator while weighing much less, which saved over £1,000 and allowed a smaller, more efficient ring. With the ring's magnetic interference better managed, the crews could go back to a normal compass, mounted well away from the coil in the tail. By the second half of 1941, the flying rings had been standardised on this better design. The strange improvised weapon of the first winter had become a mature and settled tool, so by the middle of 1940, Britain had done something remarkable. In roughly half a year, starting from a weapon it could neither see nor sweep, it had recovered the mine, understood it, made its ships invisible to it, learned to sweep it from the sea, and built an aircraft to detonate it from the air. Churchill was able to tell the House of Commons in August 1940 that the magnetic mine had, up to that time, been effectively mastered. It was one of the cleanest victories of the early war, A victory won not on a battlefield but in laboratories and dockyards and on freezing mudflats and at wave-top height over the estuary. It belonged to a whole hidden side of the war, the side fought by scientists and engineers rather than by soldiers, where the decisive weapon was an idea worked out at a bench or on a boating lake and then rushed into service before the enemy could adjust. Radar was part of that hidden war. So was the breaking of enemy codes. So was the long duel over the science of the bomb and the beam and the countermeasure. The defeat of the magnetic mine belongs on that list, even though it is far less famous because it was won by exactly the same method, clever people given a desperate problem and just enough freedom to solve it faster than the other side could make it worse, and it was for the moment a victory that belonged entirely to Britain. The Germans had built the weapon, the British had built the answer, including the flying ring that no one else in the world was yet using, which brings us at last to the German aeroplane over Ile de Groix and to the claim in the title. Because if the flying ring was a British invention of the first winter of the war, then what was a German transport doing wearing one 3 years later? Did they copy it? And if they did, how? To answer that honestly, you have to cross the channel and look at the war from the other side, and you have to notice something that is easy to forget. Britain was not the only nation whose shipping could be strangled by mines. As the war went on, the traffic became two-way. The Royal Air Force began dropping its own magnetic and other influence mines into German waters, into the Baltic where German warships trained and where the ore ships from Scandinavia ran, into the canals and river mouths and coastal lanes that carried the traffic of the German war economy. The most important of these waterways was the Kiel Canal, the great artificial cut that let German warships pass between the Baltic and the North Sea without going the long way round. Mine that canal and you do to Germany, in miniature what the Germans had tried to do to the Thames. And the mines the British dropped were, of course, influence mines, magnetic and later acoustic, the very kind that could not be swept by cutting a cable. This British campaign of aerial mine-laying grew into something enormous over the course of the war, and it was carried out under a code name that has a strange gentleness to it. The Royal Air Force called mine-laying gardening, and it called the individual mines vegetables, so that a crew briefed to sow mines in a particular stretch of enemy water was, in the dry humour of the service, being sent out to plant a garden. Bomber crews flew thousands of these sorties, seeding the Baltic, the German river mouths, and the canals with influence mines, and over time this quiet, unglamorous work sank a remarkable tonnage of enemy shipping and tied down huge German resources in trying to clear it. Every mine the Royal Air Force planted was a mine the Germans then had to find and destroy, which is precisely why the Germans needed an answer of their own, and needed it badly. So the Germans found themselves in exactly the predicament Britain had faced in 1939. They had an enemy sowing invisible mines in their own vital waters, and their conventional sweeps could not clear them. And they had been handed, as it happened, the same kind of head start the British had found in the mud at Shoeburyness. A British magnetic mine had been recovered off the coast of Jutland in the autumn of 1939 and taken apart, so that German scientists could study at close hand the very kind of influence weapon they would soon have to defeat. As the Royal Air Force's mine-laying grew heavier through 1940, and more vegetables were planted in the rivers and canals and coastal lanes on which Germany depended, the need for a fast way to clear them from the air became urgent. And so, in the spring of 1940, the German Air Force ordered the work to begin. The man who drove the German answer was a physicist named Theodor Benech, whose scientific background, as it happened, was in precisely the right field, the behaviour of magnetic coils and magnetic fields. Working with a distinguished professor of physics, Walter Gerlach, Benech reasoned his way to the same conclusion the British had reached, that an artificial magnetic field generated from an aircraft could detonate the mines from above. They designed a large ring around 15 metres across to be carried by an aircraft and energised to throw a mine-detonating field down into the water. They tried the ring on several aircraft types and rejected them, and in July 1940 they ordered it fitted to the sturdy, patient three-engine transport that would carry it for the rest of the war, the Junkers Ju-52, the same corrugated workhorse our Typhoon pilot would meet over Brittany. The minesweeping version was designated with the letters MS, for the German word meaning mine search, and the crews gave it an affectionate nickname, Mousy, a little mouse, or more exactly a mouse catcher, hunting the mines that hid on the bottom. The conversion was completed in the late summer of 1940. The first test against a disarmed British mine was flown at the Junkers works at Dessau on September 7, 1940, and the ring proved it could trigger a mine's fuse from altitude. The first operational sortie followed within weeks, out over the Scheldt estuary near Vlissingen, on September 19, 1940, where the ring aircraft detonated 2 British-laid mines. From that autumn, the Germans stood up a special mine-searching unit, and then a whole series of squadrons that would sweep with the flying ring across the Baltic, the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and above all along the dangerous coast of occupied France for the rest of the war. The Junkers transport was not the only aircraft the Germans hung a ring on. They also fitted the Great Hoop to flying boats and float planes, aircraft that could work over open water far from any airfield. A large 3-engine flying boat was converted to carry the ring braced above its nose, and a pair of big 4-engine float planes were fitted with loops as well, and these seaplane sweepers cleared mines in canals, rivers and estuaries, including stretches of the Danube where the Royal Air Force had been busy planting its vegetables. Spares and airframes were always short, and the seaplane conversions faded out as the war went on. But for a time, the German mine-searching force was a small, strange fleet of ringed machines of several different shapes, all doing the same patient, hazardous job. The units endured to the very end of the fighting, and in one of those turns that only a war's aftermath produces, some of the surviving German ring aircraft and their crews were put to work after the surrender, clearing the countless mines that still choked European waters, sweeping alongside their former enemies to make the sea safe again for everyone. Now we can weigh the claim in the title, and we can do it honestly, which is the only way worth doing it. Did Germany copy Britain's ringed aircraft? The tidy, satisfying answer is yes, and the tidy answer is not quite true. Here is what is true, laid out plainly. Britain flew the flying ring first. That is not in serious doubt. The British D.W. Butler's Wellington detonated its first mine from the air in January 1940. The German Junkers Ju-52 minesweeper did not fly its first operational sortie until September 1940, 8 months later, and the work behind it was set in motion by British-influenced mines. One of them recovered off the coast of Jutland in the autumn of 1939, and by the rising tide of British mines sown from the air. In the plainest sense of who did it first, Britain won that race, comfortably. Anyone who tells you the Germans flew a ring aircraft before the British is simply mistaken, and there are indeed some published accounts that carelessly date the German aircraft to 1939. Those dates do not survive contact with the careful German records, which place the whole programme firmly in 1940. The British were first, but first is not the same as copied, and this is where the honest story is better than the myth. There is no good evidence that the German engineers ever saw a DW-9 Wellington, or its plans, or a photograph of its ring, and worked backward from it. What the evidence actually shows is 2 teams of capable scientists, cut off from each other by a war, each handed the identical problem by the other side's minds, each reaching into the same body of physics, and each arriving independently at the same answer, because it was the right answer, and very nearly the only one. The physics of a magnetic mine allows only so many solutions. Fake the ship's field and blow the mine at distance. On a ship, that means towed cables. In the air, that means a coil, and a coil carried by an aircraft is, unavoidably, a ring. Benecke did not need to steal the idea of a flying ring any more than a second inventor needs to steal the idea of a wheel. He was a coil physicist handed a captured British mine and told to keep his own waters clear of the ones still falling from British bombers. The ring was where the problem led. So the truthful verdict is this. Germany did not copy Britain's ringed aircraft in the sense of stealing a blueprint, but Germany did follow where Britain had already gone, arriving at the same machine by the same logic, a little under a year behind and pushed there by Britain's own minds. It is not a story of theft. It is a story of convergence, of 2 enemies solving the same puzzle with the same tools and coming up with the same strange flying hoop, which is in some ways a stranger and more interesting thing than a simple copy would have been. When engineering is honest and the physics is hard, enemies start to resemble each other. The ring was not British or German, it was what the problem looked like once you understood it. That convergence extended even to the details and to the dangers. The Germans, like the British, soon found that magnetic mines were not the only influence weapon they had to fear, because the Allies also used acoustic mines, triggered by the sound of a ship's engines and propellers rather than by its magnetism. A magnetic ring was useless against a mine that listened instead of felt. so the German minesweepers adapted. Alongside the Ring aircraft, they flew aircraft carrying a device that made loud underwater noises, a container of small explosive charges dropped to fool the acoustic mines into firing. A typical German sweep might send 2 Ring aircraft side by side, a short distance apart with a noise-making aircraft trailing behind, so that magnetic and acoustic mines alike would be tripped in a single pass. The mines would detonate in the water, a short distance behind the aircraft, close enough that the crews lived, every single sortie, with the knowledge that a mistake in height or timing meant the sea itself would erupt beneath them. It was the same bargain the British crews had made at 35 feet over the Thames. There was one cruel difference between the two air forces, and it is the difference that closes the circle back to the cold morning over Brittany. The British flying rings, in their most dangerous home waters period, were largely spared enemy fighters, and where they were exposed they had fighter cover. The German minesweepers, especially along the French coast in 1943 and 1944, flew into some of the most heavily contested airspace of the entire war, over water that Allied fighters roamed at will, and they did so slow, low, unarmed at first, and without adequate fighter protection of their own. A Ring aircraft cannot dodge, it cannot climb away quickly. It is flying a fixed low pattern over a fixed piece of water, wearing a 15-metre metal hoop that makes it unmistakable and unmanoeuvrable. To an Allied fighter pilot, it was almost the easiest target imaginable, and a valuable one, because every minesweeper shot down meant a German waterway that stayed closed a little longer. The Germans slowly added heavier defensive guns to their minesweepers as the losses mounted, but there is only so much you can do to defend an aircraft whose entire job is to fly slowly and predictably at the sea. Which is why, on December 30, 1943, a Junkers Ju-52 minesweeper of the 1st Squadron of German Mine-Searching Group 1 was caught over the water off Ile-de-Groix, near Lorient, by the Typhoons of 266 Squadron, wearing its great ring, unable to run, unable to climb, unable to turn hard enough to matter. The credit for the kill went to 2 of the squadron's pilots, Flying Officer Mollett and Flying Officer Lucas, and their gun camera film of the Ring transport falling toward the sea has survived as one of the strangest images of the whole air war. The German pilot who died there, a young non-commissioned officer named Johann Stampfer, went into the water with his crew. The encounter our story began with was not really a mystery at all. It was the logical, brutal endpoint of everything that had come before. The German crew were doing, over their own occupied coast, exactly what British crews had done over the Thames estuary nearly 4 years earlier, flying a flying ring low over the sea to clear an invisible enemy weapon, and paying for it. The ring the British pilot half remembered from the first winter of the war really was in a sense the same ring. Not stolen, converged upon. The same answer to the same question, worn now by the men on the losing side of the encounter. The convergence of the 2 flying rings was really just one round in a much longer contest, because the mine war never stood still. As soon as the magnetic mine was mastered, both sides reached for triggers that a magnetic ring could not touch. The acoustic mine listened for the churn of a ship's propellers, which is why the noise-making aircraft had to fly alongside the ring. Later still came a trigger cleverer than either, a mine that sensed the change in water pressure as a ship's hull displaced the sea above it. That kind of mine could not be faked by any coil or any noise box, because you cannot conjure a passing ship's pressure wave from an aeroplane, and it proved almost impossible to sweep by any influence method at all. Each new trigger forced a new answer, and each new answer forced a new trigger, an invisible arms race running the whole length of the war beneath the more famous battles on the surface. The flying ring was never a final victory. It was one clever move in a game that kept changing its own rules. It is worth sitting with the human weight of that, because it is easy to tell this as a clever story about physics and forget what it cost. The men inside these aircraft on both sides were not fighter aces or bomber crews striking at cities. They were, in the most literal sense, minesweepers who happened to fly, doing patient, dangerous, unglamorous work that saved the lives of sailors they would never meet. A British merchant seaman who sailed safely up a swept channel into London never knew the name of the crew that had cleared it from the air. A German warship that passed unharmed through the Baltic owed its passage to a mousy crew flying its slow circuits over the water, with the sea ready to explode beneath them. This was rescue work carried out in an aircraft, and the men who did it, in the Royal Air Force and in the German Air Force alike, faced a particular kind of fear. The fear of the deliberate low pass over a weapon designed to break steel, made again and again until the tour ended or the aircraft did not come home. If your family history touches any of this, the mine disposal officers, the wooden trawler crews of the minesweeping service, the ground crews and engineers at the aircraft works, or the air crew of the reconnaissance and mine-clearing units, their names deserve to be spoken. Leave them in the comments below. A name written down by a grandchild is how these quiet trades survive the passing of the people who practiced them. And this channel exists in large part to keep exactly these kinds of stories from slipping under the surface for good. So what is the final reckoning of the whole affair? Not the myth, but the true shape of it. The German magnetic mine of 1939 was a genuine masterpiece of aggressive engineering, a weapon that for one winter came closer to throttling Britain than most people ever realized, and it was beaten not by a single genius, but by a whole culture of improvisation acting at once. Officers who took the weapon apart in the mud, scientists who made ships invisible and taught trawlers to fake a magnetic heartbeat, and engineers who bolted a car engine and an aluminium hoop into a bomber and flew it at the sea. Britain built the flying ring first and built it fast, and built it under the personal impatience of the man who would soon lead the country. That much is a clean British achievement, and it deserves to be remembered as one. And then the war turned the tables, and Britain's own minds put Germany in the same trap, and a German physicist with the right background reached independently for the same solution and found the same ring waiting at the end of the same logic. The title of this video asks why Germany copied Britain's ringed aircraft. The honest, and I think better answer, is that Germany did not so much copy the ring as be driven to it, following a path Britain had walked first, arriving at a machine so nearly identical that a British fighter pilot could recognise it in an instant over the coast of France, and yet arriving there by its own road, because the physics of an invisible weapon leaves very few doors open, and every serious engineer who understands the lock ends up filing something close to the same key. That is the real lesson hiding inside a story about a giant metal hoop. In a war, the loudest weapons get the headlines, the tanks and the fighters and the great capital ships. But some of the most decisive contests are fought over things no one can see. A magnetic whisper on the seabed, a needle waiting to twitch, and they are won by people whose names never trend, working in the cold and the dark at the very edge of what is known. The flying ring belonged to both sides in the end because the problem belonged to both sides, and the truth of who copied whom turns out to be less about theft and more about the strange way that two enemies, thinking hard about the same difficult thing, slowly come to build the same machine. There are more of these stories than you would believe, hidden inside the parts of the war that never made the films, inventions rejected and then vindicated, quiet trades that decided campaigns, machines so odd that their own side disguised their names. If that is the kind of history you want more of, the machines behind the machines and the truth behind the tidy version, then follow along because the next one is already being written, and there are a great many keys still waiting to be cut.